Welcome to Beat Diabetes, and we're going to continue to look at the book Good Energy by Casey Means. I should say by Casey and her brother, Callie Means. Callie helped with the writing of the book. I get the feeling Callie was probably the predominant writer, but she was the one who was the source for the ideas and the thoughts. And actually, you can find them both being interviewed all over the place, on podcasts, on the news. Casey, I think, gets interviewed more than her brother, but her brother gets quite a few interviews as well and seems to be right there on the same page with Casey. I've listened to a number of interviews of her, not necessarily from start to finish, but I've heard quite a bit of her sharing some of her thoughts and ideas. And one of the most curious things to me when I was just getting to know about her was the fact that I watched her once being interviewed by a guy who had a carnivore channel, and he seemed happy with her, and he was smiling and nodding and seemed to really like what she was saying. And then I saw her not long after that being interviewed by a guy who had a vegan channel, and he was smiling and nodding and seemed to agree with what she said. And I thought, wait a minute here. How can these two opposite extremes both approve and like Casey? And I guess that's one of the magical things about her popularity is she's popular with people from both sides of the spectrum. And I'll get into a little bit later why I think that is. And another thing I wanted to say about her is she is sort of a female version of Benjamin Bikman. Benjamin Bikman, of course, has come out and said so many of our modern diseases and afflictions are all coming from the same source, which is metabolic syndrome. But Ben Bikman is much stronger on the idea that we should all be eating low carb and no sugar. Now, she's very much in the no sugar camp. And sometimes she sounds like she's low carb and sometimes she doesn't. And that's why she could be on a carnivore channel one day and a vegan channel the other day. But she is kind of like a Ben Bikman. She picks apart all kinds of different diseases and afflictions and says they're all coming from metabolic syndrome. And she's also very similar to the late Sarah Hallberg, Dr. Sarah Hallberg, who was also a medical doctor and realized early on that she did not want to be simply a pill pusher. And Casey Means was trained as a surgeon, and of course, as a medical doctor, she prescribed a lot of medications, but very quickly she got nervous about or uncomfortable with the idea of just fixing everybody's problem with pills or surgery, and began to focus more on lifestyle and diet. So I give her kudos for that, and I'm big about that as well. There are some differences between my own beliefs and hers, but in large part, I agree with much of what she has to say. For today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about Casey herself and how she came to this, and then a few of her thoughts related to what she believes is the way to fix our problems. And she was born a big baby. She was almost 12 pounds, and she felt that part of her problems, she had a lot of health problems growing up and issues with sinusitis and different things. And she felt that part of her problem was that she was such a big baby, which she felt was a result of her mom's high glucose, and that high glucose and predisposition to diabetes was passed on to her. So born a big baby, they did a C-section. She was not breastfed, and she felt that was part of her health problems. So she didn't grow up a very healthy child. And in fact, get this, by the age of 8th grade, which would be around 13, 14, she weighed 210 pounds. 14-year-old girl, over 200 pounds. Well, that is a big girl. And she mentions the fact that she ate a lot of junk food. She talks about Reese's Puffs cereals, Lucky Charms, Dunkaroos, never heard of those. Rice Krispie treats, yeah, I ate a lot of those. Goldfish, Hostess cupcakes, and so forth. Well, that is not a good thing at all, but most of us did that. But most of us didn't get up to 200 pounds in the 8th grade. I ate all that stuff, or most of it, plus some things she didn't name. And when I was in the 8th grade, I was probably around 130 pounds at 5'9" or so. So we didn't all get that big. But the thing that I find interesting that's kind of a marker or an indicator of her personality, shortly after she reached that 210 pounds as a 14-year-old, she made the commitment, I'm going to lose this weight. I don't want to be big like this and have people make fun of me. So she studied all kinds of books, and she read recipe books, and she studied nutrition, and she did a lot of research, and she started exercising. And lo and behold, in 6 months' time, she went from over 200 pounds as a 14-year-old down to a normal weight, which for a 14-year-old girl, I suppose that would be around, 120 maybe. She doesn't mention how far she got down, but she said normal weight. So she lost a lot of weight in 6 months' time. An indicator that this young lady at that time, was powerfully motivated, and you can see from her book, she still is. And she never really got that big, but she did have some health issues as an adult. So let's talk a little bit about that. She says by being an athlete, eating healthy foods and so forth, she was able to keep her symptoms at bay. And she was fairly healthy from that point on, up until she graduated from medical school and became a resident and a surgical resident. She had just graduated as a medical doctor. And she talks about all the miseries of and the pressure on young first and second year doctors, and they get all the worst times that they have to work. They don't get much sleep. They're on call all the time. They don't have time for long leisurely dinners, and so they're usually just grabbing food, and they're living on caffeine. And she also blames the fact that she didn't get much natural light. She's really big about natural light and talks about how she would spend days at a time indoors with just fluorescent lights on her. So she said she got sick again. And she starts listing a few of the things that she suffered with as a young 20-some-year-old doctor. One was irritable bowel syndrome. I know a little bit about that, although she seemed to have it worse than I ever did. She says, for me, the IBS was manifested as abominable gas coupled with watery diarrhea 8 to 10 times a day. Wow. So having bowel movements all over the place, very watery, very frequent. She talks about acne that she felt was a result of high glucose and metabolic syndrome. She says multiple studies have found a low glycemic load, that is low sugar, or a low carbohydrate diet can lead to significant reductions in acne. So she had a lot of acne, and she was apparently very much concerned about that as a young adult. Depression. And she says the onset of uncharacteristic depression during my surgical residency has a strong metabolic link, and strongly suggests that if you've got metabolic problems and you've got high glucose and runaway blood sugar, it can cause depression. That may well be. I'll have to be honest, I never experienced that. I've definitely been there with the metabolic syndrome, high glucose, bouncing and plummeting blood sugar, but I was never depressed during all that time. Depression has never been a big issue with me throughout my life. So she goes on to talk about chronic pain. She had neck pain. Now, I did have neck pain, but I found out it was because I was staring at a computer screen at the wrong angle. And I think I was looking up. And when I adjusted my computer screen to eye level, where at about the 2/3 height of my screen, and I also got a pillow that was more supportive of my neck. And it went away. So, but she mentions a bunch of other things. And then she starts talking about all the other areas of physical afflictions and diseases and problems in our health that she felt. She didn't necessarily say she had all these, but she felt they were a problem as a result of metabolic syndrome. She doesn't often say that. She'll a lot of times say bad energy. She's really into the good energy, bad energy. But it's metabolic syndrome and high glucose and high insulin and so forth. But she talks about infertility, fatigue, fatty liver disease, strokes, dementia, heart disease. And then she talks about COVID that I thought was interesting. I wanted to kind of quote that. She makes the statement, the COVID-19 crisis was one of the most dramatic and intense examples of conventional medicine's metabolic blind spot that I've ever seen. In other words, they got it so wrong. They were just totally blind to the fact that if you've got serious metabolic syndrome, you're a sitting duck for real problems with COVID. But she says this in many studies on COVID-19 mortality, 80 to 100% of the people who died had other chronic health problems, of which the most common were metabolic issues, such as type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. Other studies showed that patients with metabolic syndrome had a 77% increased risk of hospitalization and an 81% increased risk of death. Well, we all sort of felt that, and some people were saying that back in those days, and she's confirming that now that it's pretty much past, we're looking back and we're saying the ones that mostly died, you can't say 100%, but the ones that mostly died had some serious metabolic problems. So, like I said, in a way, she's sort of like a female Ben Bickman. She's looking at all these things, at strokes and dementia and infertility and all these problems, irritable bowel syndrome, arthritis, and different things. And she's saying they all seem to have their roots in metabolic syndrome, which is another way of saying insulin resistance, which relates to bouncing blood sugar or constantly high blood sugar. Either way is dangerous. If it's bouncing up and down all the time, that's not good. And I'm not talking about gentle rises. That's fine. That's natural, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when it's bouncing up to 200, then dropping down to 70, and that's your frequent post-meal experience, that's a problem. So one of the most powerful things I've read so far, I haven't read the whole book yet, but one of the most powerful things I've read so far from Casey, as a young surgeon, she was getting the feeling we're doing too many surgeries and we're not recommending dietary changes. So here's what she said. Whenever I asked why we were performing surgery or suggested a potential dietary intervention, doctors with seniority reprimanded me with comments like, we didn't become surgeons to give dietary advice. Wow, that pretty much says it all. We didn't train and spend all kinds of money to get an education to become a surgeon so we can go around giving dietary advice. Even, they didn't say this, but what they're implying, even if it'll do them some good, that's not why we're here. We're here to cut people. We're here to cut them open and remove things and add things or move things around. We're here to cut or to give pills in some cases. We're not here to give dietary advice. And yet, what if there was a diet that could fix most of these issues without surgery and could eventually get you off pills altogether? In many cases, not all, but many. What if there was a diet that could fix all these things? The answer is there is a diet. Now, she and I differ a little bit about what that diet is, although she gives hints that she kind of leans the low-carb way. And let me give you this statement. We changed our diet to more carbs and sugar, and then she puts in parenthesis, to disastrous effect when the food pyramid was released in the 1990s. So she's saying it was a disaster. But when they put out the food pyramid, we all said, yes, master, and we changed and ate more carbs and more sugar. Now, when she says things like that, I'm like, yeah, she's one of us. But then she says some other things that indicate she doesn't seem all that convinced that the carbs are really that much of an issue. And I'm like, no, she's not really one of us exactly, but she's close. So there's like a couple of circles that intersect at a certain point. And so there's an intersection point where she and those of us that are into the low-carb diet, like Dr. Fung, Dr. Westman, and different ones, we completely agree, but there's other areas outside the intersection points that we don't exactly agree. Do you need more information and inspiration about beating diabetes? The very first line of our description is nearly always a link to our hundreds of videos toward that one subject, how to beat diabetes. Click on that link and start watching these videos. You'll be blessed and, I believe, greatly helped.